Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video we'll take a closer look at the RX 460 instead of continuing with the no longer supported GCN 1, 2 and 3 architectures. As part of the Polaris family, a fancy name for GCN 4, the card supports DirectX 12 features and still enjoys game-ready drivers from AMD. The game results will provide an insight of how much is that worth by comparing this card with the previously reviewed DirectX 12 card, the R7-260X, who must settle not only with legacy support drivers, but also with lower operating frequencies. And speaking of frequencies, the buffing GPU used by the card can boost up to 1200 MHz, 15% more than the R7-260X. My sample is paired with 2 GB of GDDR5 at 1750 MHz, 16% higher than the OCV3 version of the R7-260X we reviewed previously, using an identically sized bus of 128 bits. The shader count is the same, 896, same goes for the TMUs and ROPs of 56 and 16 respectively. Judging by these values alone, one can expect a performance boost of around 30%, but let's not get ahead of ourselves and instead check out the thermal solution. Which is nothing to write home about. I mean, I've seen cheaper cards that at least had a shroud around their aluminum floor and 2-pin fans, but I guess Median could not be bothered with it and left it completely naked. Still, thanks to the 75 watts TDP, temperatures do not increase more than 65 degrees Celsius in heaven for a delta of 40 C over ambient and 70 C in Warframe for a delta over ambient of, you've guessed it, 45 C. To get a better image of what the card is capable of, we'll run it in the same Z230 workstation with the same i7-4770 equivalent Xeon and 32 GB DDR3 at 1600 MHz in dual channel. Alien Isolation is interesting for this review because it is old. No game updates, no unfair driver updates dedicated for that game. So how does it run at 1080 resolution and ultra settings? Well, 87 FPS on average and 55-41% lows, making the RX 460 about 30% faster than the 260X in this game. And spoiler alert, this trend will continue. The firing range in Apex Legends ran at 94 FPS at 1080 resolution and low settings. The 1% lows stayed in the mid-60s. This is also 30% faster compared to the previously reviewed card. The trend holds for all tested resolution all the way to 720, where the 1% lows were higher than the average at 1080. At least at low settings, this game will run fine on the RX 460. I would not worry too much about the results in Warzone. With the training map removed, it's a bit more difficult to provide a consistent test. At 720 resolution and low settings, the average FPS reached low 50s and 1% lows hovered in the low 30s. A previous test, however, had these values higher, so your mileage may vary, depending on your location in the game map. Now, the following game typically performs better, but only the numbers can confirm this. Well, Battlefield 5 at 720 and low settings did perform better than Warzone. The RX 460 averaged 80 FPS in the training map, 6 more than the 260X. The 1% lows didn't reach 60, but it got quite close. The experience felt good, to the point that I attempted a 1080 run, but the FPS will drop to 65% of what the card provided at 720. After seeing how forgiving Control ran on weaker cards, I was quite optimistic, and boy did the RX 460 deliver. Like before, the test consisted of a run between ventilation and the power plant, at 720 resolution and low settings. The card averaged 92 FPS and had a 1% lows number in the low 70s. This is better than the 260X by the same margin that you'd expect, of around 30%. Increasing the resolution to 1080 will have these numbers, but this may be still okay for this single-player title. Rainbow Six Siege showed a 20% improvement with the RX 460 over the R7-260X on pretty much all resolutions and rendering scales tested. The average FPS ranges from 91 at 1080 resolution and 100% render scale to 208 at 720 resolution and 50% scaling. As mentioned in the previous videos, 720 resolution introduces a CPU bottleneck, made more obvious by the 1% lows. There was no improvement when scaling down from 100% to 50%. GTA 5 doesn't really like going above 120 FPS, and even the benchmark run will run into weird scenarios, with the camera getting stuck at one angle. The only way to have an acceptable gaming experience is to increase the visuals to high, but even then the RX 460 averaged over 70 FPS at 1080 resolution, and the 1% lows stayed above 50. The card has enough headroom to push those numbers higher by dropping a few quality settings. Fortunately for the competitive gamers, the following game does not suffer from this kind of quirks. As a result, CSGO happily runs at over 200 FPS on average on the RX 460. Compared to the R7-60X, this is about 20% better. The 1% low stays over 100, so at least at 1080 resolution and low settings, the game experience is quite fine in DA dust. Just don't forget to set the bots on easy mode. The results you're about to see got Dota 2 on my radar. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the game ran pretty much the same on the RX 460 as on the R7-60X. And I cannot blame this one on using a different match replay. I made sure I used the same. While the behavior is still to be investigated, owners of the RX 460 can enjoy the 92 FPS average and 52 FPS for the 1% lows. Fortnite kept the trend of running about 20 to 30% better on the RX 460 than on the older R7-60X. The Polaris card averaged over 100 FPS at 1080 resolution and performance mode, with the rendering distance set to far, with the 1% lows at 31. Quite rough. Something is off though. While the FPS improved at low resolutions, the difference on average between 1600 by 900 and 1280 by 720 is a paltry 4 FPS. This is a typical CPU bottleneck, but seeing it around 130 FPS is a surprise to me, since last year I was able to reach over 180 FPS. This may be due to the engine change, but only future testing can tell. Overwatch 2 provides the same 30% improvement when running on the RX 460 compared to the previously reviewed card. At lower settings, averages range between 130 FPS at 1080 resolution and 260 FPS at 720. Half the pixels, double the FPS, which makes sense for this game. The 1% lows are at around 70% of the average, and overall the game feels very smooth. Rocket League didn't get the memo regarding the 30% improvement and ended up running 50% better on the RX 460 than on the R7-60X. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the average shot up over 200 FPS and the 1% lows peaked over 100. It may be that this is one of the games that did benefit from a driver update, since the frequency values alone do not explain the improvement in performance, at least in my opinion. Splitgate did behave as expected, but only at 1080 resolution and low settings. The average of 128 FPS that the RX 460 got is about 25% more than what the R7-60X got. I cannot explain the 1% lows value though. This game typically runs smooth. At 720 resolution, the 1% values went to 132 FPS, which makes sense for the 210 FPS the card got on average. And it is this average that now looks off, being just 10% better than what the R7-60X got. The performance delta is much smaller than at 1080 resolution, hinting at a possible CPU bottleneck. The following game will show a similar situation. Valorant had a similar improvement of less than 10% when switching the older R7-60X for the newer RX 460. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the card averaged 263 FPS and had a respectable 160 FPS for the 1% lows. This makes the game play well, but it also puts it on the list of games to keep an eye on for CPU bottlenecks. Genshin Impact is not really the best tool to test GPUs due to its FPS cap. However, it is a popular game for good reason, so making sure if a card can run it or not does make sense. No fears with the RX 460 though, it reaches the 60 FPS on average easily, and the 1% lows is in the low 50s. The game plays just fine. As for the HiRez Studio trio of games, Paladins, Royale and Rogue Company, all of them ran at 1080 resolution but at different quality settings. With the exception of Paladins, the games did run a bit better on the RX 460. Paladins got 129 FPS on average with 70-41% lows at mostly high settings. Royale 136 FPS on average and 53 FPS for the 1% lows, also at higher settings. And Rogue Company 144 FPS on average with 1% lows of 92 FPS at low settings. World of Tanks Blitz, much like Genshin Impact, serves to point out the cards that cannot meet the FPS cap. The RX 460 is not one of those cards, and with 1% lows at 58 FPS, the game runs just fine at 1080 and low settings. Warframe serves two purposes: benchmark and torture test for the worst case scenario for thermals. Now, we already covered the temperatures, so we're left with just the gaming performance in the Mariana mission at 1080 and mostly low settings. The RX 460 averaged 138 FPS and had the 1% lows close to 100. The game plays fine, and it is able to point out the same 20-30% improvement over the R7-60X. As expected, the card performed better than the R7-60X by pretty much the margin provided by increased frequencies. To me, cutting off GCN 1, 2 and 3 from game-ready driver support, but keeping GCN 4 and 5 seems more and more arbitrary, at least from a point of view that looks only at the technology. I just don't see how GCN 4 and 5 are closer to RDNA 1, 2 or 3 than are to GCN 1, 2 and 3. Ranting aside, I quite like the card. It is a nice budget DirectX 12 GPU that enjoys game-ready driver support. It is no wonder that other creators like it, especially for budget builds. I bought mine for about $25 US. That is lower than most GT 1030s go for, and the Radeon will wipe the floor with the 1030. It also ticks another checkbox for me, with the lack of extra power connectors. I liked that in the HD 7670 and the HD 7750, not to mention the GT 1030, and I wish more cards would manage to do so without them. The next video should keep us grounded to the GCN 1 architecture, and despite the GPUs bearing different names, they are actually sister cards. That's for another pair of videos. As for this one, we're done. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I'll see you for the next one.